Um, so hi everyone, welcome and thank you for coming. This is actually our third annual virtual honors thesis celebration and award ceremony. So hopefully our last virtual. I assume that we'll be back in person next year, but I do think this allows for like a very nice, inclusive, accessible, broad audience to come from all over the place. So there are some benefits. In any case, welcome, good morning. My name is Amy Nan, for those who don't know me, and I am an associate professor of anthropology here at UCSD. I want to welcome you back for this annual celebration to honor our undergraduate anthropology honors thesis students, and we'll be hearing their thesis presentations as well as granting awards after that to our top anthropology graduating seniors this year. So just a couple of notes before we get started. Please note we're recording this session, so be mindful and keep your microphones muted until you're called on to ask a question. We appreciate everybody coming. The format today is that we have 4 speakers who will each be presenting their talks for about 12 to 15 minutes, probably closer to 15 minutes each of them. And hopefully we'll have time for a minute or 2 of questions after each talk. And then we'll also reserve some time at the end of all 4 talks for open questions for the whole group or for anyone that you want to follow up with. And you can send your questions to me privately in the chat, or you can send them openly to the group in the chat window as the speakers go. You can also raise your hand to ask questions at the end of each talk. I'll moderate the questions. I can read them aloud if you send them in the chat window. And then we'll have time at the end for open Q&A for all the presentations. So let's get started with our 4 speakers today. We have Jack Ran, Sinyu Kai, Bianca Loyola, and Silas Eckhart. So those are the 4 that are presenting today. We'll have more honors thesis students that we will mention later. These are the 4 that completed the full year of our coursework and are planning to present. So I'm really proud of these students. They stuck it out for this entire year, even though I forced them to be remote the entire year for this class. And I'm very impressed with their dedication, their perseverance in this like very independent remote environment. So great job, guys. You've been at it since last spring, many of you, for more than a year, including the summer, and you worked hard on this on your own with, of course, the help of your mentors, but very, very independent with this remote environment. So we should all be very impressed by what they were able to accomplish over this year. So their projects span sociocultural, biological, and archaeology today, and they demonstrate really nicely the breadth of the majors and the topics of the majors in our department. So we've got some really nice diversity here. Without any more delay, I'm going to get started. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, which is Jack Ran. He is a sociocultural anthropology major and a political science double major with a minor in philosophy. And his thesis is entitled Seeing Like a University. I've enabled Jack to share his screen, so you can go ahead and start sharing. And I think that looks good. We can see it. And I will hand it over to Jack to go ahead and get started. Thanks, Jack.
All right, thank you, Professor Nan. Sorry, just setting up here. Okay, so to begin my presentation, we start off in winter quarter 2020 with the cost of living adjustment movement, which was when a lot of graduate student workers went on a wildcat strike to protest the unjust living conditions that they were living through. Many of my undergraduate friends and I organized many rallies and organized with these graduate students in support of this overall movement. However, at one of these rallies, the rallies pictured here, we had heard that administrators actually sent undercover police officers to monitor this sort of protest. And we had also heard later that day that at an undergraduate pro-cola meeting that they were also going to be sending undercover police officers to monitor that meeting. So this experience kind of, spooked me, scared me quite a bit. However, from this, I prompted my curiosity into researching not just surveillance at UCSD, but also this broader idea of information collection and how that can lead to social control. So this curiosity led me to the work of the anthropologist James C. Scott and his book Sing Like a State, which I believed offered a very good theoretical lens to understand information collection and by institutions and how that is linked to social control. So what is the book about? So generally speaking, it's about this idea of states and how they make the world more legible. So leaders, technocrats, and experts often have these very lofty utopian dreams to remake society. And in order to remake society, they must take the large complexities of human life and reorganize them in order to make sweeping changes to human affairs easier. And once they've reorganized this, their utopian dreams can then be enacted. These projects can oftentimes, however, fail on their own goals, on their own terms, because of this need to make the world more legible. So what exactly does legibility entail? That is the process of reorganization, simplifying, standardizing, and categorizing the world in order to make it more, again, legible to the technocrats who are overseeing these projects. And it makes it easier for leaders, bureaucrats to sort of understand what's even occurring. So an excellent example that Scott gives of this is the capital of Brazil, Brasilia. As you can see from this image, it is very symmetrical. It's very nice, very neatly planned, very sterile. It was meant to sort of inspire other Brazilian cities into sort of this sort of model of a centrally planned city. However, this did end up being a failure. While it did sort of succeed in the sense of ensuring social control over Brazilian people and in eliminating many of the issues they had with other urban cities, such as slums and crowdedness, it did prove to be socioeconomically quite unequal. And eventually, much of the city's later growth had to be built through many of the construction workers who built this planned part, building around the city in an unplanned fashion. So with all this in mind, I took these ideas and I applied them to our university, UCSD. And this is part of the research. So as you can see from this image, this is what I studied, the UCSD administration. The image looks quite complicated, quite all over the place. However, this is nonetheless an actual simplification of this sort of very large bureaucracy and administration that's occurring at UCSD. So in my research, I studied 5 different administrative units: human resources, the UCSD Police Department, the Communications Office, internal auditing, and ERC Student Affairs. And also conducted some participant observation research through this HR training session I attended. Most of the questions I asked were about information collection and for what purpose the information was being collected for. And I used the theory of, again, the anthropologist James C. Scott to understand what was occurring in my interviews. So generally, I found these sort of main themes within my interviews. So one of them was, yes, there was lots of information collection. There was this idea of simplifying groups of people into easier to understand abstract categories and data points. And there was also this very frequent and common reference to either me or students or anybody administrators were working with as consumers, clients, and customers. So my research shows that UCSD does make the campus legible. Almost every department has a means of collecting, simplifying, and standardizing information. And an excellent example of this was this very thing you're seeing on screen now. It is a screenshot of this HR training session that I was invited to attend. And as you can see, it shows how administrators literally need everything to be made clear to them. There can be no informal interactions. Everything must be recorded. It must be documented. It must be written into a textual format. And a similar process was occurring in almost every single department I interviewed. This idea of everything had to be recorded, everything had to be categorized. And here's some other quotes from my interview. So we have one from an employee relations specialist that says, "We have an army out there of employee relations analysts and generalists that really do a lot of the work up front. They could be embedded in other departments." And this other one from a UCSD police officer who jokingly said, "This is going to sound big brother-ish, but we have numerous databases that we can go to." So all this is sort of meant to show that administrators are aware about their information collection techniques and this is sort of their attitude towards it. And this also sort of hints at something like what Scott described of information collection, simplification in order to make the task of administration easier. So as mentioned earlier, there's always these sort of utopian goals behind these lofty projects. So for an analogy, what would UCSD's more utopian goals be? That would sort of be its mission statement. So many of the administrators mentioned that a lot of the work they do is to fulfill the various mission statements that UCSD publishes. So Here on screen, we have UC San Diego will transform California and a diverse global society by educating, generating, and disseminating knowledge in creative works and engaging in public service. So the administration exists to fulfill this statement. However, they also mentioned that a lot of their goals were this sort of customer service thing. So in a sense, there's almost like two projects occurring here. One is to sort of generate this excellent university that can, again, educate the public, improve society. However, there sort of seems to be this sort of other secondary goal of this sort of revenue generation as seen through the language of referring to students and even faculty, even other staff members as clients, as customers who are buying a service from UCSD. So the goal of the university is not just to make a good university, but to organize UCSD in such a way as to sort of generate revenue to fund many of the goals of these mission statements. The vision is that of a financially self-sufficient university with a fair exchange between administrators and customers. So there's a socioeconomic context to why all this is occurring. So university revenue has been declining over time. This is actually pulled from a UC a 2018 accountability report showing a loss of state funding per student. In order to make up these shortfalls in funding, however, the university is requiring greater outside sources of funding. So as you can see, either through tuition or from students or private donors. So the university seems to have reorganized UCSD to secure this outside funding from what they are calling clients, customers, et cetera. And also, as is all this is occurring, they do seem to have this emphasis on ensuring that there are not increases in pay for workers, that there's sort of a minimal amount of expenditures, and that they can decrease the amount of money they're spending while increase the amount of money they're gaining. So it's important to note that Scott's work was during the sort of heyday of socialist and state capitalist modernization projects that was meant on helping everybody. So the goal was sort of to use resources to improve the lives of as many people as possible. These grand projects were state funded, state managed, imposed from above. However, UCSD, it should be noted, is occurring within a very different socioeconomic context, and that leads to sort of different goals and different means of enacting this idea of making the world more legible. So it's occurring within this more neoliberal era where things are being more privatized. The utopian project of UCSD is not this like lofty goal of making everyone better off, but in sort of this generating revenue, this sort of fair market exchange between the administration and the people it interacts with. In essence, it's all about making a fair exchange within a market between, again, clients, customers, and the administration. So again, Scott's work does focus on not only why and how things are made to be more legible from the administrator standpoint, but also how this attempt to make the world more legible does lead to some sort of failure. So the administration does make the campus, as I've mentioned previously, more legible to itself. This does result in an increase in bureaucracy, greater social control, and the general inability to reach the goals that they set out in their many mission statements. So an excellent example of where all this sort of breaks down is, again, returning to this cost of living adjustment movement, where there was this frequent discourse by graduate students that the university was not living up to its expectations, where graduate students and faculty were unable to conduct the proper research that they were promised. Students were sort of getting a worse education and a worse experience overall. So in conclusion, yes, the UCSD bureaucracy is engaging in this process of making the campus more legible as described by the anthropologist Scott. In order to fulfill their mission statements, the reason they're doing this is, again, to fulfill their many mission statements, but also to enact this project of a fair exchange that helps to fund the university, as well as the socioeconomic context for all this is privatizing forces that are putting pressure on the administration to sort of function in the way that they do. So with all this in mind, is there something else to have than making the campus more legible from the vantage point of administrators? Well, Scott did emphasize and believe in the power of autonomous, independent, and decentralized groups of people making decisions for themselves to improve their lives. Instead of this sort of vast bureaucracy that aims to make student lives better, why not let the students organize systems for themselves, which we do have evidence for this on campus. We have the many decades old student worker cooperatives in our student center. We have 4 of them pictured right here. And many of them are, again, autonomous. They are student run. There is no sort of administrative interference, and they are quite successful at things that the administration would love to do in creating these excellent self-learned pedagogical spaces where students are able to learn more about the world, sort of become better people, have these excellent organic undergraduate experiences that the university always tries to provide, but doesn't seem to be able to get to. And yeah, and with that, I would like to thank Professor Peterson for his guidance and assistance with this project, Professor Nan, and my honors thesis cohort for the feedback and direction of this project, and many of my friends at one of the worker cooperatives that I work at, Ground Books Collective, for being the reason and motivation for this project in the first place. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack, for a terrific talk. Excellent job. Really fascinating. I think there will be a lot of questions, as everyone in this audience is part of this bureaucracy that you talk about, and we all are affected by everything that you've spoken about. We do have time for a question or two, so does anyone want to raise their hand or just jump in with a question now? Or do we need time to digest the talk? Okay, I'll ask one question now and then we can come back, and I'm sure there will be many more later. You talked a lot about like the administration as a bureaucracy controlling everything in the university. And I know that our university is really proud of our academic senate system, where the faculty actually like have some control over some of the laws or policies, policies of the institution. Do you have any thoughts from your interviews or observations that you did? Did people talk about that, the role of the faculty in leading the institution and setting the policies, or were they more focusing on the bureaucracy and the administration? Did that come up in your interviews?
So there was, it was interesting. So the university, they sort of divide the campus up into like students, undergraduate students, faculty, and staff, clerical workers. And each administrator I spoke to sort of focused on one of those three narrow fields. For the people I did try to speak to about sort of like the various faculty at UCSD, there was this strong sense that like they were there to sort of augment and support this, again, faculty or research oriented university. But there was also this sense that like by supporting or helping, it wasn't just like, oh, the faculty does what they want to do and we're there to support them. It's more like this, I think one person I interviewed mentioned like, oh, our task is to make sure the faculty stay on track, to make sure that they're the best, most meritocratic, most, the smartest researchers in the world. And that's why, our department exists, just to sort of augment that mission. So in general, there was not a strong sense of agency among either other students, faculty, or staff when speaking to administrators. It was this sort of language of they exist and they do their own thing and they're just there to help them. But in terms of like actually leading the university, that never really seemed to come up in any of my interviews.
Interesting, thank you. There's a lot of chat. Congratulations about the presentation. One question, if you can share your paper. So the theses that the students wrote are going to be available in printed form in our Spiro library very soon, but I'm sure we'd be happy to share them by email for anyone who asks. So our data librarian would like to see it. So assuming Jack's okay with it, we can send it to her. Anyone else who'd like to see the full thesis as well, just let us know or let Jack know and we're happy to share it. Fantastic job. Any other questions at the moment, or should we move on? Suzanne, thank you.
Hi, yeah, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. I just wanted to mention that I think when the university was built, it was built at a time, during the Vietnam War and at a time when a lot of protests were going on. And I think it was actually built, the campus was physically built for surveillance. A friend of mine who used to teach here, who now teaches at another university, told me when I first came that like the Price Center, the design of that area in front of the Price Center, it's sort of like a pit, like sort of like an amphitheater. in front of the Price Center, that was built so that to prevent occupations, by students, and to make it so that students who are collecting there could be surveilled, by the administration or by the police or whoever. The buildings were also built so that there was no central, there's no central quadrangle on the campus, with the administration. If you go to traditional college campuses, often the administration is in a very prominent place in the middle of the campus. It was deliberately spread out so that to make, I think, the administration sort of hard to find. And the buildings were designed without central entrances so that, it would be harder to occupy them. So I think that, from the beginning, assuming that what my friend told me was correct, which makes perfect sense, because this was really I think UCSD was really a hotbed of protest in the early 1970s. Sort of that has been built into the architecture of the university. And, so it makes what you're saying now makes a lot of sense, sort of given the background of the university.
Did you want to comment on that, Jack, briefly?
Oh, yeah. So thank you for that comment. Yeah. When I first got to UCSD, I do remember hearing, again, all of the same stories about yes, the bowl-shaped sort of architecture, this sort of campus design that's meant to suppress protest. And I did really want to go through that research rabbit hole and including that in my research. However, I spoke to a lot of people, and it seemed like that was, again, it was something, as you mentioned, someone told you that. I couldn't actually find any strict textual evidence. It was sort of this weird, almost not an urban legend per se, but this sort of oral tradition passed down of yes, the university was built in such a way as to suppress protests. But in terms of some perfect sort of a smoking gun of some document that says, yes, we designed the school in this manner to suppress protests, I had a lot of trouble finding that. So I couldn't verify that information, but I've definitely heard that many, many times from many people over, many different cohorts from UCSD, alumni, present students, etc. So there's probably some validity to that statement. I just couldn't actually find something very concrete and real to verify it.
Sure, that makes sense, that you wouldn't be able to find that because that would not have been written down anywhere. But yeah, it's interesting that you've also heard that from a lot of other people.
I just want to say, I've also heard the same thing when I was a student at Brandeis University as an undergraduate. They said that the same oral tradition, that the campus was designed in the same era of the 1950s, well, a little earlier, but to counter students being able to take over administrative buildings or take over any building, and with that built into the architecture. So maybe it was a common thing around the country for universities built between the 50s and 70s. We talked about that in our discussions with Jack as well. Okay, thank you. I think we better move on to our next speaker. So thank you, Jack, for terrific talk. Our next speaker today is Sinyu Kai, who is a sociocultural anthropology and psychology double major. And her thesis is entitled National Treasures on the Screen, Chinese Museum-Related TV Show and Chinese Cultural Landscape. So I will stop sharing and hand over to Sinyu to take over. And feel free to enter your questions into the chat as we go if things come to you about any of the talks as we go, and I can moderate the questions at the end. Sinyu, are you able to share your screen?
Yeah, I am sharing it now. So
Great.
can you
see it? Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Second. Hi everyone, I'm Xingyu, and my thesis title is National Treasures on the Screen, Chinese Museum-Related TV Show and Chinese Cultural Landscape. So in 2017, a Chinese variety show, National Treasures, was released. Produced by China Central Television, CCTV, and several national museums, the show introduces some cultural relics which are called national treasures of China. The show invites celebrities and experts to introduce the relics and to create artistic performances for them. The release of the show has been quite successful in China. It has attracted millions of viewers online and also leading to high ratings as well. So the presentation of each relic is through telling of two stories, the past story and the present story. The past story is performed as a historical event related to the relic, and the present story introduces the value of the relic in modern society. So my thesis aims to look at the narratives of the show National Treasure uses and the deeper implication it has for us to understand Chinese society. How does the visualization of the Chinese relics in the TV show shape Chinese culture identity and landscape? How does it demonstrate the relationship among Chinese audience, state media, and national museums? And in short, why is this project successful in contemporary China? So I argue that the show National Treasure is exploring a cultural landscape that mediates the past and the present, the profane and the sacred, and the public and the state through its narratives, visual techniques, and interactive functions. The show has also become a national culture brand, which leads to many similar cultural projects in recent years. The success of these projects require the support from not only the top, but also from the bottom social and political environment in contemporary China. And I will talk about these findings in order. So here is a quote from the chief producer of the show, Yu Lei, in an online interview. The treasure selected should be able to answer the questions such as where did we as Chinese people come from and who are we as Chinese people? So from this quote, we can see that these relics are not just dead objects. They are able to speak to the audiences and show some sort of national value, identity, or spirit. So through the narratives, one of the national spirit that the show wants to convey is a continuity between Chinese past and present. The show makes the national treasures travel through time and spaces, and these treasures are selected as indexes with culturally recognized values in both past and present China. For example, one treasure in the show, 大客鼎, is a huge bronze vessel from the Zhou dynasty in ancient China. The past story of 大客鼎 talks about Ding as a symbol of the Li system in ancient China, which ensured how people behave morally according to social order. On the other hand, the present story talks about how Ding was donated to the Museum of Shanghai in the 1950s. The donors of the Ding protected it during the World War II and then donated to the Public Museum of Shanghai after the war was ended. So here I wanted to use the concept of qualia in the anthropological context to look into how Ding was symbolized here. The qualia of an object is an index that shows the embodied abstract quality of the object, and the interpretation of it is largely based on how people and institutions make sense of it. In the case of 大客鼎, the qualia of it is hugeness, heaviness, and solemnness aligns with the qualia of the spirit of Chinese people on different axes. So how people in the past behave morally and how people at the present selflessly donated and protected the national treasure. And this spirit persisted from the imperial dynasty to nowadays China. Thus, the national relics in the show index some sort of spirit that continues to be valuable to Chinese people at the present. The show uses past artifacts to tell the story of the present, and more importantly, tell us what is valued in the present. And then moving on to the visual techniques of the show. So the visual technologies of the show are able to enhance the aura of the national treasures. This also transforms the sacred relics in the museum into profane objects on the TV, making audiences feel closer and more connected with the relics. So here is another example of how this works. This is a dance performance for the relic, thousands of miles, mountains, and rivers, and also my Zoom background is it. So the left picture shows that the dancers are making a final pose to imitate the original painting shown on the right side. And this strategy of personification of the painting, making modern dancers to imitate the old painting, not only enhance the continuity that we discussed before, but also heightens its aura and makes the painting seem to come to life. This shortens the distances between the actor and the relic, as well as the audiences in the profane world and the objects as sacred national treasures. So for the commentary functions, the show also allows much interaction among audiences. These enables them to build an imagined community with other people who also watch the same show. So on one of the Chinese video platform that the show is released, there is a commentary function called 弹幕, which is just the scoring comments show on the video in real time. So as we can see here, these are just the 弹幕 on the video. So in the case of National Treasures, the host will ask a question at the beginning of each episode. And then after the question, the viewers online will answer it through the 弹幕. So here we can see these are just the 弹幕 answering this question. So different audiences are answering the same question with the same answer. In this sense, the audiences are able to imitate a live participation in the show and also imagine that different people across different time and spaces are watching the show together with them as a collective imagined community. From many of the comments or 弹幕 of the show, there are many of them also praising the role that CCTV plays in the production, such as what is produced by CCTV is always great, and so is this one. In China, CCTV is not only the official channel, but also the most powerful and professional channel in regards to production in the culture industry. In a socialist nation like China, this official channel have the power to allocate huge resources, including inviting the largest museums, the most popular celebrities, and using the most high-tech stage effect studios in the nation. Thus, the show represents the highest standard of TV production of culture variety shows. Therefore, CCTV is considered as the central power that is able to and also responsible to guide Chinese audiences to develop the culture, historical, and aesthetic understanding of Chinese relics. It is envisioning its idea of what national treasures and Chinese nation in general should look like. Meanwhile, what we also have to notice here is that those comments like the one I showed on the slide before are not just praising CCTV for this one variety show, but the overall impression of CCTV. Therefore, not only CCTV is willing to carry on this responsibility, but also many of the audiences are willing to deliver this power to CCTV. What we see here is a rather positive dynamic between Chinese people and the official channel. So here is another example of how this dynamic works. Many netizens who watch the show will create their own artworks for the national treasures. In one episode, the show performs a song that is written by some netizens online. And in this picture, these are the singers singing this song. And those netizens also created an animation style character for the national treasures. And this back screen shows a character that was created by the netizens. So from this performance, we can see that the public can see themselves reflected and represented in this huge visual project. But it's also not to say that all comments or interactions are positive, since there are also criticisms about the actors or the narrative of the show. But in general, what we see in most cases is a positive interaction between the state and the public. So the success of National Treasures has encouraged many similar mass media projects in recent years in China that uses modern technologies to show Chinese culture heritage. The name of it has also become a culture brand that circulates in the broad culture, museum, and communication industries. So here are two examples of these similar projects. The left is a performance called 唐宫夜宴, and it's about Chinese Tang Dynasty, and it's produced by Henan TV, which is a provincial TV broadcasting. And the right side is a variety show, which is produced by a private online video company, and it explores the historical site with the 4 celebrities here. So from the branding and circulation of national treasures, we can see a sense of cultural confidence rising among Chinese people and society. And how this confidence thrives during this particular time in China can be explained by the social and political environment from both the top and the bottom. From the top, the governmental policy has largely encouraged the collaboration between media technologies and culture heritage industry. President Xi Jinping has also mentioned the phrase cultural confidence several times in public conferences, which means that Chinese people should develop their confidence by combining the essence in the past and progress at the present. And from the bottom, many netizens even create a word to describe their feelings when they are watching a show like National Treasures, which is here, and you can also see the literal translation of it. It is a very, very informal or vernacular online slang, but just because of this, it shows the feelings of ordinary Chinese public. So this confidence of Chinese people can be explained by the broad domestic and international environment in recent years, where China is having rapid economic growth, higher global status, or better living standards. This also largely explains why the central government began to emphasize the confidence in culture and art industry instead of just economic or industrial development. It is crucial for a developing socialist nation to build up a collective identity among its public in their cultural and spiritual life. So here concludes my thesis projects. So what we see in National Treasures and many other projects is the mediation between the past and the present, the sacred and profane, and the state and the public. We also see this top-bottom concordance in the cultural heritage industry in contemporary China. So for some future directions, it would be very helpful to look at those other projects that I mentioned before in detail, and maybe also more alternatives or more about the criticisms of these kind of shows. I look into some of them in my thesis, but we can definitely look more into that in future research if possible. So this is the end of my presentation. I want to thank my advisor, Dr. Ye, for her support and mentorship. I also want to thank Dr. Nan and my fellow classmates for their support and suggestions for my thesis. And I also want to thank my friends and family members. And also I want to thank everyone who attend our thesis presentation today. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you, Sinyu. Terrific talk. Really excellent job. We have time for a question. Does anyone want to brave a question for Sinyu? Yes, Julia.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. It was really, really interesting to hear about how this is. I haven't heard about this before, so it was really cool to see. And I'm curious about the stories and the treasures that they choose for the programs. Are these, how much of the retelling changes the history to be a little bit more in accordance with the current morals? Or is there a big emphasis on how it wasn't socialist enough in certain areas and now they're improving that? Or what is it like to see the dynamic between the changing political views and morals but in the past and present?
So thank you very much for your question. So yeah, like as I said before, as the producer also said in the online interview, like those treasures are carefully selected, and also the historical event related to that are also carefully like written by like the people from the production team. So there is like some emphasis in the historical event that the team wanted to make it seems to more connected with the present story or the present value. I would say that in most of the cases, people would like accept this narrative. As we see, it has a high rating, and also a lot of people are praising the show and appreciating the narratives. But also we can see some people might not agree with those things, and they might also say that in their comments, and maybe lead to some broader or deeper discussions with each other online as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Sinu. Was there another question? I think we have time for one more. If there was, yes, Jasmine.
Hi. Well, the topic's really interesting, but I remember when we talked about this last quarter, and I thought I've never heard of something like this. I'm just wondering if they kind of keep track of like what the demographic is of watching, like the age group. I know in the US, like some networks kind of keep track of who tends to watch their show the most.
So you're asking about like the demographics of the audiences?
Yes.
So I didn't really look into that for my thesis, but I would assume that a lot of them are young people, like who are using like the internet more. But there are like some people like maybe have like older age, and also there are people like abroad, like Chinese people abroad, they're watching that as well. So I would say that the population is kind of like towards like a younger generation, and also that's one of the goals of the TV program, because they're inviting like the popular celebrities, like the actors, singers, or popular idols. So I think this is one of the goals that the production team wanted to attract the younger generations, younger people to watch the show and also know about Chinese history, and like develop their like pride in being a Chinese people. So this is, I would say that is one of like the main goals of the production team.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we're ready to move on to our third speaker, who is Bianca Loyola. And Bianca is an anthropology major with a concentration in climate change and human solutions, one of our newest majors in the department. And her project is entitled Exploring the Role of Hordem Vulgare in the Decentralization of the Indus Valley Civilization. I will hand it over to you, Bianca, and very excited to hear your talk. Take your time. We saw the screen, and now we see your notes as well.
Sorry,
Okay.
I did not realize how to unmute myself. Okay, so I'm gonna start this over again. Okay.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to find the unmute in the Zoom window.
Okay, are you seeing my actual like
Yes.
slide? Okay,
We see the slide now.
sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. So for the purpose of my presentation, I'm going to be discussing two of my main research questions that I explored in my thesis. How does the size of barley change throughout the occupation of the site of Frappa? And how can we use this data to understand the collapse of the IVC? But first, I'd like to briefly introduce the Indus Valley Civilization, or what I'll be calling the IVC. This is, the IVC is one of the four major early urban centers that developed in the Old World. The others being Mesopotamia, and there's, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the China Yellow River civilization. The IVC had over 1,500 settlements, and it was roughly the size of Western Europe, or about twice the size of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Here are some artifacts from the IVC that you might be familiar with. The IVC is particularly well known for its incredible city designs and sewage systems, as well as its seemingly egalitarian form of government. So why barley? Barley was a staple crop in the IBC, meaning that there's a lot of barley within the archaeological record that we can use for research. It's fairly drought resistant, it can survive some of the least arable soils, and studying its resilience during the IBC collapse might give insight into how it can respond to climate change in the future. But most importantly, when it comes to the IBC, our archaeobotanical collection from the site of Harappa is particularly suitable for this research because it's the only collection with samples from all 4 major cultural periods that span the IBC's duration. As we all know, barley is primarily used by humans as food, but it can also be used as fodder for animals or for making beer. It also has a long and rich history. Archaeologists have been able to determine that the wild form of barley was processed and eaten by Neanderthals in Shindar Cave, Iraq, between 36,000 and 46,000 years ago. And the earliest evidence for beer malting occurred 13,000 years ago in Rakafet Cave, Israel, by humans utilizing bedrock mortars. When it comes to fodder, it's been used for thousands of years to feed domesticated animals and was likely used to feed cattle and buffalo in this valley, given the continuously growing evidence for a dense cattle population. Here we have a close-up topographical map of the IBC during the height of the civilization. This is the site of Harappa, which I'll be focusing on. It's located along the Indus River here, and this river is fed by glacier meltwater from the Himalaya mountain range, which is up here. This is the Gagar Hakra River, which I'd like to point your attention to. It'll become relevant later on. Here are some pictures of the site of Harappa. In the bottom left, there is a drawing of how the city might have looked in its heyday as depicted by the archaeologist Mark Knoyer. Just like the other major urban centers in the IBC, the city of Harappa was well planned with distinct boroughs enclosed by thick walls and a fairly impressive sewage system. Since this is an investigation that spans the entire occupation of the site of Harappa, understanding how the cultural complexity of the IBC changed throughout time is important. I don't like using the phrase cultural complexity because it's a fairly difficult phenomenon to measure and no argument can ever do it justice. However, if I were to apply this theory based solely on material culture, this is what I imagine the curve to look like. The IBC gained prominence throughout the region during period 3. In the so-called collapse, is believed to have happened around 1900 BCE during period 4. In reality, the word collapse is a misnomer, and instead we need to look at the IBC as having undergone a reorganization of society. Technology and material culture remained fairly complex, as you can see in the tail of my graph here. It only shifted towards another location. This was taken from a recent study that's only one of many attempting to solve the mystery of the decentralization of the IBC. When I say decentralization, I want you to imagine this image here. If Harappa and other urban centers were controlling polities, even if it was just in a market sense, then something happened that made them less relevant to the function of everyday life for people in the IBC. In the top left, we have period 3, when the Indus civilization was at its height. The red dots are smaller settlements, and the white dots are the major urban centers. Most of them are along the Indus River here. When you move into period 4, you'll notice that these smaller settlements move away from the Indus River and into this area here called the Ganges region. My study doesn't focus on these periods on the bottom. However, you can notice, you can see here that the settlements continue moving towards the Ganges region, and towards the end here, there's none along the Gagar Hakra River. So what happened to the IBC? Currently, the leading theory is centered around climate change. Climate scientists and archaeologists have determined that around 1900 BCE, the Gagar Hakra River began to shift course and dry up. This is likely related to the 4.2 Ka event, which was a cold but arid period that happened around 4,200 years ago, in which the summer monsoon shifted to the south and the winter storm system coming from the west began to decline. So here's the winter storm system. It's the westerlies coming from the Mediterranean. And they go in this direction towards the Indus Valley civilization. And then here is the monsoons. During the IBC, it went like basically straight up the Indus River. And then nowadays it goes more towards the central area of the peninsula. So since the Gagar-Haka River was supplied by moisture from these two storm systems, the shifting of these storm systems had a significant effect on the river's water levels. This is the Gagar-Haka River today. It looks like this most of the year, but the monsoon rainwater still reaches it in the summer and causes dangerous flooding that makes the river restricted to citizens. Of course, 4,000 years ago, it wouldn't have looked like this, but with a decline in westerly moisture in monsoon activity, the level of the river would have significantly decreased year round. The question is, how much water was required for agriculture? With the drying of the Gagar-Haka River, communities would have been motivated to migrate to the cities or to the Ganges region, which had the potential to cause overcrowding and civic disorder. And in the event that the drying of the Gagar-Haka River didn't cause the decentralization, there's still clear evidence of expansion into the Ganges region, which would have led to the overextension of the social systems, political or economic, that govern their way of life. So what can Barley tell us about the IBC collapse? It's not often that the words barley and civilization collapse are used in the same sentence, but studying barley as well as other botanical remains can provide insight into the lives and cultures of past societies. We can turn to modern uses of barley to infer past cultural practices such as cattle herding and beer brewing. Archaeological methods allow us to analyze the quantity and distribution of specific subvariants of barley, which can infer personal preferences or taste as well as utility. Finally, analyzing the change in seed size over time can infer agricultural practices as well as relative growing conditions. My research focuses on this application. My main goal was to investigate the change in seed size and variant throughout the occupation of the site of Harappa. My sample size included 239 carbonized grains. They were all hulled. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to identify the variant of each grain, but they were all within 90% completion. My methods included measuring the surface area of the ventral side of each grain, which then allowed me to infer agricultural practices and growing conditions. Here's an example of one of the carbonized barley grains from the Harappan Archaeobotanical Collection. I used the program TPS-DIG to digitally capture the ventral side of each grain by placing these red dots around the circumference. Then a fellow lab member used Python to calculate the surface area. We decided to use TPS-DIG rather than standard archaeobotanical methods because we were testing out a new method using geometric morphometrics to identify each subvariant. Unfortunately, things didn't work out, but if you have any questions about this method, feel free to ask at the end. Here are the results. On the top is a density plot comparing the distribution of each period, and the table on the bottom is the data used to create the plot. The x-axis refers to the surface area in millimeters squared, while the y-axis refers to the average quantity of seeds within that range. As you can see, each period is distributed relatively equally with only a few minor differences. The greatest difference can be seen in period 2, which quickly became evident after running an ANOVA and Tukey test. The ANOVA showed that there was indeed a statistically significant difference between each period, but this can be explained by the Tukey test. I've highlighted every statistically significant p-value in red, and as you can see, they're all related to period 2. Before we go any further, I'd like to briefly explain growing conditions. But when I refer to growing conditions, I mean the condition of the local ecology that determines the quality, quantity, and size of the seeds. Growing conditions include the moisture in the soil, the temperature, and the nutrients available to the parent plant. When it comes to barley, when the growing conditions are the best or ideal, the parent plant will produce large seeds, which have increased viability and fertility. When the parent plant experiences stress, it'll focus on increasing the yield count rather than the size of the seeds. Stress can impact the size of the seeds during the vegetative growth phase and the reproductive phase, which includes flowering. So what does the data tell us about the growing conditions experienced at the site of Harappa? Since I'm not extracting environmental data from the seeds themselves, and I'm only measuring their surface area, I can only rank each phase based on an imaginary ideal relative to the other phases. More research can tell us exactly how much nutrients was available to the barley during these phases, but for now, I can rank them from the most ideal growing conditions to the least ideal. With this in mind, period 1 experienced the most ideal growing conditions since it had the greatest proportion of large seeds and the smallest proportion of small seeds. Period 3 ranked second, followed closely by period 4, and finally we have period 2. at the least ideal growing conditions. Again, this does not reflect the actual quality of the soil during these time periods. Instead, we can look at period 1 as a benchmark for all the other periods. Overall, I find these results extremely interesting, but they left me with more questions than I could answer. Why were the most ideal growing conditions during Harappa's infancy? And why was it immediately followed by the least ideal growing conditions during a time when the city was expanding? Fortunately, there was significant improvement during period 3 that seemed to continue into period 4. But why did the quality of barley remain stable when the civilization was so unstable? Looking at the data beside my graph depicting the change in cultural complexity, there doesn't seem to be any correlation. However, one thing we can confirm is that the strategies that the IBC employed throughout the decentralization period ensured that the people of Harappa had enough barley. So that leaves us with the conclusion that growing conditions were relatively stable. Even though period 2 experienced less than ideal growing conditions, the size variation wasn't that much different than the other periods. Unfortunately, my data cannot determine if they were actually good growing conditions or poor. In other words, we need environmental data to determine the exact quality of the soil and the climate during this period. With that said, if Harappa was actually importing its barley from the Gagar-Hakar region, as some scholars suggest, then that it complicates the matter even further. Because if the river dried up and the growing conditions between period 3 and 4 were relatively similar, then that implies that the city of Harappa was well suited for agriculture and was able to transition to growing their own barley rather quickly when everyone moved away from the Gagar-Hakar River. So why wasn't Harappa producing its own barley to begin with? The only sure evidence of farming has been found along the Gagar-Hakar River, so until we can find more evidence, it's likely that the major urban centers like Harappa imported their barley. If this was the case, then when the farmers moved to the Ganges region and overcrowded the cities, the political and economic influence of the cities was overextended and civic disorder ensued. As you can see, the situation is quite complicated. There are multiple environmental and sociocultural factors at play, and until we can gather enough data, or perhaps decipher the Indus script, we won't know what exactly caused the decentralization of the IBC. My research was only a drop in the bucket, but it has answered one thing. Whatever happened, the people of the Indus Valley civilization were extremely resilient, and through agriculture, they managed to maintain relatively stable growing conditions throughout the occupation of the site of Harappa. That's the end.
Thank you, Bianca. Excellent job. Really fascinating, and your interest and passion definitely show through. We've heard a lot about barley throughout this year and learned so much that we didn't even know we wanted to know about barley, and now we're so interested. So thank you. Do we have time for a question or two? Does anyone want to ask a question in the chat or raise your hand? It's been a big shift of topic. Okay, great. Nathaniel, thank you.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Bianca, that was great. Amazing work. My question is focused on the failure of the methods themselves, or the inability of those methods to answer your questions. What would you do instead to answer your core research questions and your core interests? Do you think there is more room within the realm of barley, which you're very aware of now? Do you think there's room to address your core questions, or do you think you need other lines of data? That's basically it.
Yeah, so barley can actually answer quite a bit about the culture, I believe. Here's a few questions that I had considered asking further. I think what we really need to really use barley to answer questions about what happens if we were to, because it's just one small proxy, we would need more environmental data. And I think one good source would be to actually see like if they were like using fertilizer, or where they were getting the barley from, because if they were getting the barley from the Gagar-Haka River, then that could explain why these urban centers that were potentially controlling the civilization, why the civilization was, seemingly collapsed. But if they were growing it in this river, if we were to analyze the barley that way and get that environmental data I spoke of, we could also potentially figure out where they were getting the barley from. I think the overall situation is fairly complex, and we do need more data from all different areas of archaeology and climate sciences. So,
Thanks, Bianca. Any other questions? Okay, there's one in the chat from Julia Sloan asking, does the taste of the barley change? I don't know if she means with the variation or size. Or...
Yeah, and the size and everything. If just wondering if there would be any other reasons for seeking out different sizes of seeds or different uses of those.
Great question.
Yeah, actually, so I mentioned subvariants, and there's two variants. They're called 6-row and 2-row. That probably means nothing to you, but in reality, you can actually, they do have slight differences. One, I think it was the 2-row barley. That one, at least in the present, is mainly used for beer malting. I think it has a less bitter taste, and that's why they use it for beer. It makes it more smooth. And I've also read in the literature that 6-row barley tends to cause indigestion and not taste as good. I've also read that like in like Roman times and what have you, like barley was generally reserved for like the peasant class or for fodder. And so I'm not really sure if the size itself would determine the flavor. Because realistically, the actual like the protein content, which is what's most important for barley itself, nutritional wise, it stays the same despite the size. At least that's what the agronomic theory has told me so far.
Thanks. Just to follow up on that, Bianca, you originally were trying to distinguish between the 2-row and 6-row variant, right? But then, well, that was the purpose of your geometric morphometrics analysis, and that didn't work out. Can you just tell us for a moment about that technique?
Right. So the technique, geometric morphometrics, is something used commonly in like biological anthropology or modern ecology sciences. Basically what it does is it takes the overall shape, like the outline of the specimen, and tries to see if there's some kind of pattern between the different variants of or subspecies of the organism. My organism was barley, and the subspecies was the 2-row and the 6-row, and they look very similar. And whenever it comes to standard archaeobotanical methods, it takes a lot of training and it takes a lot of training and looking at barley a lot to really determine what the difference is between the two subvariants. So the methods use statistics to categorize or classify these two subvariants. And I used this method. It was proposed for the first time on barley, I believe in 2014. And this research paper that I was basing my methods off of, it worked for them, for their barley collection, but for my barley collection, it did not work. In fact, it classified 100% of the 239 grains as 2-row, which we know for a fact was not true. So I couldn't use this method. Something was wrong with the method, and I didn't have enough time to correct for this. So I analyzed the size data, and this is what I came up with.
Thanks. I just wanted everyone to know all of the work that went into this that maybe you didn't get a chance to see. But things don't always work out, and that's how we figure out what methods are useful. So thank you for sharing that, Bianca. Okay, I think we better move on to our final speaker, and we're going to shift gears. So thank you, Bianca. Terrific job. We're going to shift gears again to a biological anthropology talk. And our final speaker is Silas Eckhart, and he is a bioanthro major and a minor in environmental systems. And he's going to speak to us today about his thesis entitled Human Adaptation to High Altitude Hypoxia, Examined Through a Genetic and Epigenetic Perspective. I see your screen is shared and we see the full slide. So great. And you can get started whenever you're ready, Silas. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. Okay, so I personally didn't think much about oxygen until I got diagnosed with sleep apnea a few years ago. In general, oxygen is something we don't really consider until we don't have it. So many of us experience acute periods of hypoxia or low oxygen throughout our life. Maybe you have sleep apnea like I do, or asthma, you may smoke or like to swim. And all of these include periods of intermittent lack of oxygen or hypoxia, which stresses the body. So why is oxygen so important? Oxygen is vital for the process of cellular respiration, which generates energy and keeps our cells alive. And despite air being the main way that we receive oxygen, oxygen is actually only a fraction of the gases that we breathe in. So the actual amount of oxygen you inhale in each breath differs depending on which altitude you are at. This is due to atmospheric pressure pressing the gas molecules closer together. So as you increase in altitude, there's less atmospheric pressure. Therefore, less molecules of oxygen are able to be held together in the same quantity of space. So if we consider sea level to be the baseline, we can see here that blood oxygen saturation drops sustainably as we increase in altitude. Here are some of the popular high altitude places, such as Colorado Springs. We are at 20% less oxygen than at sea level. Pikes Peak, we're around 40% less. And if we jump to Mount Everest, there's nearly 70% less oxygen than at sea level. So if you've ever traveled to high altitude, maybe you felt some of these symptoms from lack of oxygen. Here are some of the main symptoms listed here from acute altitude sickness. These include fatigue, shortness of breath, and even more severely, things like cognitive impairment. So despite these potential health effects of living at high altitude or heights greater than 25,000 meters, around 1% of the world's population still lives at high altitude. On the right here, we have a breakdown of distribution of people living at high altitude. The majority of them live between 2,500 and 4,000 meters. And on the left here, we can see where these high altitude regions are. Some of the most popular include the Ethiopian, Tibetan, and Andean plateaus. So people have migrated to these high altitude plateaus at different times throughout history. The oldest native highland population is thought to be the Tibetans, who have resided at average altitudes of over 5,000 meters for over 35,000 years. Andeans and Ethiopian highlanders both migrated to high altitudes around the same time, although Andeans tend to live at much higher altitude than Ethiopians. So considering the timing and the extent of this exposure to high altitude is critical in understanding how long these humans have been adapting to high altitude. So in addition to hypoxia, high altitude is incredibly hospitable to life, and this is due to the high UV radiation, low temperatures, and strong winds. So in order to be able to survive, organisms, including plants, animals, and humans, need to develop unique ways to adapt. So plants do this by changing leaf structure. Animals such as this mountain goat have a beautiful coat. Modern humans, we have cultural adaptations such as these coats and oxygen masks that these people are wearing here. However, my research is going to focus more on biological adaptations. And these biological adaptations have deep evolutionary roots, such as archaic Homo sapiens, such as the Denisovans, have likely inhabited high altitudes in Asia tens of thousands of years before the first Homo sapiens. And so some of these physiological adaptations we see in modern humans today have been found to share a genetic linkage to the Denisovans. So here are some of the examples of the most common physiological adaptations that we observe in native high altitude populations when compared to lowlanders at high altitude. And my research specifically is going to be focusing on lower hemoglobin concentration. So what's so important about having a lower hemoglobin concentration? So as the availability of oxygen decreases, the body tries to compensate by producing more of the oxygen carrying protein in red blood cells called hemoglobin. So however, this is actually considered to be a maladaptive response because as the levels of hemoglobin increase, blood viscosity increases and this reduces blood flow. And since blood flow is reduced, this can lead to hypertension and heart failure. And this actually further exacerbates hypoxia because oxygenated blood isn't able to be moved around the body. We can see that here in this typical CMS patient with the dilation in the legs, as well as this blue color in the lips, indicating that oxygen is not being transported through the blood. So around 5 to 10% of the people living at high altitude today are at risk for developing CMS. However, not all high altitude populations fare the same. We found that Andean highlanders are more likely to develop chronic mountain sickness than any other highlander group. So that has led us to wonder, why do some groups adapt better to altitude than others? And so in order to investigate this question further, we need to look at what are some of the biological mechanisms, such as the epigenetic or genomic differences that could influence these high altitude adaptations. So prior studies have found that genetic differences, such as single nucleotide polymorphisms or SNPs, likely play a role in influencing these phenotypes. SNPs are a single change in the nucleotide between persons. In this example here, we have a C allele changing from a T allele in between these two individuals. One technique of measuring these SNPs is looking at a genome-wide association study or a GWAS study. And so prior GWAS studies have found unique SNPs in hemoglobin regulating genes. Some of the most common include EPAS1, England1, and EPO. Epigenetic variations in these genes have also been identified to influence high altitude physiological response. And epigenetic differences differ from genetic variations because they do not affect the underlying genome. The most common epigenetic variation includes methylation, which is where a methyl group binds to a CpG site, and this can alter gene transcription. So while differences in methylation have been observed in these genes that I mentioned, epigenetics is still a fairly recent field and much is still being discovered. Since so much is still not known about epigenetics in high altitude in particular, this is what my research primarily focuses on. And so my research takes two steps to answer this question. The first component is a literature review that identifies the current scope of what is known about epigenetics in high altitude. And the second component uses existing genetic data collected by the Simonson lab in native Andean highlanders to investigate this question further. And since we did not have epigenetic data available, we decided to use this genetic data that was available to investigate genes under positive selection that are known to have epigenetic implications by regulating transcription. So for my literature search, I decided to search PubMed for articles relevant to epigenetics and high altitude, and I found 90 search results. However, upon screening these results and filtering down to the articles that only contained original data in human populations, only 8 search results were found to be relevant. And of these 8 articles, 3 of them studied Andeans, 3 studied European lowlanders traveling to high altitude, and 2 studied Tibetan highlanders. All of these studies, except for one, contained methylation data, and these candidate CpG sites that were associated with high altitude phenotypes were collected into a table in my full thesis. And I also noticed that half the studies were conducted by one author. So overall, this tells us that while at first it may appear that there are a lot of epigenetic studies since so many results came up, in actuality, there's a limited amount of real epigenetic data being published and rather an abundance of review articles. So this led me to want to contribute some of my own original data to the discussion so I wouldn't just be already adding to the abundance of literature reviews on high altitude. So this led to me working with Dr. Taman Simonson and her lab. They have been collecting data from a cohort of lifelong residents in Cerro de Pasco, Peru. This cohort of individuals includes folks both with and without chronic mountain sickness. And from this cohort, whole genome sequencing data was extracted from blood samples, as well as CMS phenotype data, such as hemoglobin concentration, sleep data, and blood pressure. So using this data, we decided to look at genes that are under positive selection in the cohort that may be relevant to epigenetics by regulating gene transcription. So to do this, we first filtered the genomic regions using a statistical test known as the composite of multiple signal scores, or the CMS score, that identifies regions under positive selection. I know the acronym is a little confusing since it's CMS, but this is a different CMS. So the composite of multiple signal score. So we used a cutoff of CMS score greater than 6 to filter genes that are known to be under positive selection. We then looked at these gene functions by using a tool called gene ontology that identifies genes known to be transcriptional regulators. And transcriptional regulators are known to have epigenetic importance since they determine which genes are going to be expressed. And once we identified our transcriptional regulators, we then filtered this list again by the CMS score to identify those top genes most under positive selection. And we selected those top 20 genes. So these genes were then further investigated to identify the top phenotypic association and SNPs from prior GWAS studies from publicly made available data using the 1,000 Genomes Project. So, and then taking these SNPs from prior studies, we then generated a linkage disequilibrium heat map to identify the most interesting SNPs in LD with our Andean cohort. So linkage disequilibrium is particularly interesting when talking about genetics, since it's the tendency for alleles to be inherited together more often than by chance alone. And this is usually caused by close proximity of genes on the same chromosome. And this is particularly important for population genetics, since you can use LD data to infer when different genomic events such as integration events have occurred. And this can give us information about genetic ancestry. So let's take a look at one of the examples of the heat maps we have generated here. On the x-axis, we have our chromosome position, and our y-axis, we have our SNPs in association. The blue colored is this D prime value, and the red color is our R squared, both which give the statistical likelihood of the two SNPs being associated together. And we're going to be focusing on the R squared, which is this red color, since it's a more standardized way to look at LD. So here we're going to be comparing the SNP found in our Andean cohort just upstream of the TBX5 gene. On the right here, we have a heat map generated with the most closely related population found to our Andean cohort in the GWAS catalog, which is the Peruvians. We can see that there are multiple genes here found to be in LD, as indicated by the darker red color. I also put the R squared value over here on the right. While most of the SNPs were in like moderate to low LD around 0.4, we did found that this one SNP, RS648995, that was found to be almost imperfect LD with an R squared of 1. So when we compared that to all the populations from the GWAS data in the 1,000 Genomes Project, excluding the Peruvians, to see if we found similar patterns of LD. We found that most of the SNPs they're in a weak LD, so they're a lot lower, but this one SNP, this RS648995, still remained to be in pretty high LD and had an R squared of around 6. So this interesting pattern means that this one SNP could be relevant in studying high altitude effects on different populations, while these other SNPs may be more indicative of a Peruvian specific haplotype. And so that was just one of the examples of the more interesting patterns that we found on this one of these heat maps. And the phenotype associations where these SNPs were particularly interesting. In this example, many of the SNPs were found to be associated with PR interval and arterial fibrillation, which have to do with heart function. And this is something we saw in all of our results, with many of the SNPs associating with interesting blood phenotypes, such as hemoglobin concentration or red blood cell measurement. So to summarize my results, we found that little original data had been done in epigenetics and high altitude. Most of it from my systematic review was focused on Andeans and Tibetan Highlanders. The second part of my research aimed to address this gap by using genetic data in the Andean cohorts that has an epigenetic relevance to identify candidate SNPs in high LD that have been associated with blood phenotypes. And this research is not only relevant in a medical context for better understanding diseases such as chronic mountain sickness, but as well as holding importance in evolutionary biology. So I wanted to take a moment to help recognize the people that made this thesis possible. First, thank you, Wanjun, for all your help in analyzing data and teaching me R. I could not have done this without you. Next, I'd like to thank both of my amazing co-advisors, Dr. Tatum Simonson and Dr. Amy Nan, for their guidance and mentorship in writing this thesis. Dr. Simonson in specific, thank you for letting me join your lab and trusting me with your data. And lastly, I want to thank all my friends and family who came to watch and support me today. Even if you didn't understand a word that I said, I'm really glad you're here. So thank you again.
Terrific job, Silas. Very impressive work. I think you've come a long way in getting everyone to understand this, which was a complicated thesis to explain. And you learned so much, obviously, in doing this. And it's really clear how much you learned. So that's awesome. Okay, let's open to some questions for Silas, if there are any in this moment. Let's see. Don't see any hands raised yet. I'll ask one question to get us started, but I guess my first question is just, what do you think is the next step for this research? Like, is there a particular finding that you had that you'd want to follow up on in a specific way, or do you think we need to go back and get more data? What do you think is the next step?
Yeah, definitely like looking more at these LD patterns. I specifically, like, I really wanted to look more into this one since it was found to just be like in such high LD that was prevalent across different populations. So I guess we'd really want to start looking at these heat maps more and like seeing the ones particularly like with these really interesting blood phenotypes and probably looking at like different studies and like what is known about those so far.
Great, thanks. Anyone else? Okay, I think you just explained it all so well.
Can I
Yes.
ask one more question of
Yes,
Silas?
yes, thank you, Tatum.
Yeah, well, thank you, Silas, for such an awesome presentation. I know you had mentioned that there were some samples collected over time. Do you think you would want to do anything with those? Maybe, you know, looking at how people respond over time, or if maybe epigenetic changes are happening, or do you have any, you know, suggestions of what we could do with those data?
Yeah, I always think like, because epigenetics is so interesting, like, because we can like look over time, since genetics is like, you need to look at like generational, since epigenetics, we can look at the same individual and how it changes over time. I think that would be probably the next step of like seeing like how these epigenetic changes actually related to the phenotypes, particularly with like CMS and things like that.
Awesome, thanks.
Great, thanks. Oh, we have one more question in the chat from Julia. She's asking, was there information on whether or not the mothers were pregnant while in high altitude? Great question.
I don't remember for this cohort. Tatum probably knows better than I do.
We might have to defer to Tatum.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we, at the time we were doing these studies, we were collecting phenotypes on like control of breathing and sleep. And so we actually excluded pregnant females, but we are collaborating with a group who does study specifically pregnancy at high altitude. And so it would be great to work with that group, look at epigenetics, you know, see if there are any complications in mothers and sort of lifelong effects in the next generation. So I think those are all really interesting questions, but not anything that we have directly in our lab.
Yeah, actually, just to follow up, our department just heard a great talk by Maria Nieves Colon last week about high altitude adaptations. And I mean, this was not the focus of the talk, but she mentioned the placenta having an adaptation in Andeans and that there was a genetic finding that might relate to preeclampsia. So we've invited Maria to come. We have a symposium coming up, actually the moment to invite you all to our symposium. Tatum, do you want to introduce it? briefly? Yeah.
Sure. Yes, actually, our colleague who does study pregnancy in women at altitude in the Andes will be our second speaker of the day. But Amy and I co-direct a center with other faculty on campus, including Paul Ponganis in Scripps Institution of Oceanography and other members of health sciences to look at, it's called the Center for Physiological Genomics of Low Oxygen. And so on June 16th, we have a virtual symposium and we'll have a few different talks and trainee presentations. There's still time to sign up if people are interested. Again, as Silas pointed out, there are so many ways that availability of oxygen can affect our lives. So not just at altitude, but in clinical settings as well. And so our team is really looking at that from all different angles, diving mammals to sleep apnea. So if you're interested, please join us. And I can put a link in the chat.
Yes, I was about to say that. There's another question from David Rodriguez asking, does the local indigenous use of the Andean coca leaf play a role in this search for solutions? Silas, do you know anything about that?
No, unfortunately, I don't know anything about that. Yeah.
Tatum, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so the question is about the coca leaf.
Yeah.
Yes, so it definitely, right, is something that is used, helps people feel better. We, again, exclude people who use any sort of coca leaves for our studies, just because we're trying to get at the heart of, trying to decrease the number of variables that we're looking at. But interestingly, I have a meeting at noon today with our collaborator because I have a trainee in my lab who's quite interested in some of this. And I know there's actually another person in emergency medicine here at UCSD who is also quite interested in this question as well, and sort of what the effects are. And honestly, it seems like it's been very understudied, which seems interesting because it is so commonly used in this population. So yeah, great question.
Thanks. I just want to take a moment to open to questions for any of our speakers now. If anyone has a question for an earlier speaker or for Silas, feel free to jump in now. I think there was one in the chat. I'm going to scroll back to. Yes, there was an earlier question from David Rodriguez, I think for Sinew Sai, about do people try to implement narratives relating to the Great Leap Forward? Likewise, does the state try to suppress narratives relating to the Great Leap Forward? Sinew, are you here still?
Yeah, I actually replied to this question through the direct message.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I guess I would just say that since the show is like focusing more on the Asian history, so there's like in this show, there's no narrative related to this event per se, but that just as I said before, the show is selecting or emphasizing some of the narratives or not emphasizing some of the narratives. So yeah, so this could happen. Yeah, but there's no narrative related to this event per se. Yeah.
Thanks. Other questions for any of the speakers? All right. This might be a good time for us to transition to our award part of our ceremony. Yes, thank you, Julia, for the comments. All the chat windows full of congratulatory comments. So let's have a round of applause. You guys could turn off your mute buttons if you want. Great job, everyone. Really incredible talks. I'm really proud of all of you. You've come such a long way from a year ago in developing these ideas, and really so proud that you all dug into real data and interpreted it really thoroughly. Terrific theses from all four of you. Okay, I will share my screen again so we can get back to the award ceremony. Let me just present mode. Okay, great. So let's move on here to presenting our awards for our top anthropology graduates this year. Let me see if I can transition the slide. So the first award I'm going to present is the Washburn Award for Excellence in Biological Anthropology. You can see the awardees from the past 20, 30 years here. So just to give you a little bit of context, Sherwood Washburn was a major figure in biological anthropology and an early advocate of the field study in the study of comparative primate behavior, an important student of extinct hominids, understood through the functional study of comparative primate anatomy. So this is who we honor in our biological anthropology name of the Washburn Award. And this year, the Washburn Award is going to be shared by 2 biological anthropology students who are graduating this year. The first one had the highest grades in our new major of our BS in biological anthropology, which was Amanda Chambers. I'm not sure if Amanda is here, but let's just give her a round of applause. I believe she was notified. We'll make sure to notify her again if she's not here. So congratulations, Amanda. And our second awardee is Silas Eckhart. Congratulations, Silas. You did a terrific job in all of your anthropology courses, and you completed this really exciting and challenging honors thesis. So another round of applause for Silas. Congratulations. Unfortunately, we can't hand you the certificate in person, but we will be sure to, sorry, let me present the slide. We'll be sure to mail it to you or bring it by the mailroom for you guys to pick up if you'd like. Okay, great. Let's move on. Our second award is for archaeology, and it is the Adams Award for Archaeological Anthropology. Robert McAdams was a former adjunct faculty member of our department, and he was a major comparative archaeologist of early state formation and a pioneer in the study of broad regional systems. This year, our archaeology award goes to Bianca Loyola. Congratulations, Bianca. Excellent thesis, excellent grades. I do want to announce Bianca is going to go on to get a master's in anthropology next year at Oxford University. So congratulations, Bianca. We look forward to hearing from you how that works out and what your next steps are. Okay, we'll make sure to mail you that certificate. Next comes our Hallowell Award for Sociocultural Anthropology. So our Hallowell Award is in honor of Irving Hallowell, who was a sociocultural anthropologist and one of the founders of the field of culture and personality, a pioneer in the cross-cultural use of psychological testing. And this year, the award is also going to be shared by 2 students, one of whom led a book publishing effort in her human rights advocacy class and wrote an honors thesis proposal, who is Pacey Manaya. Pacey, are you here? Maybe not, but unfortunately, Pacey wasn't able to finish throughout the year with our honors thesis course, but we were very, very impressed with all the work she did in her courses and in leading this book publishing effort in her human rights class. And then our second awardee is Shinyu Sai. Congratulations, Shinyu, for a terrific year, a terrific honors thesis. Great job in all of your coursework here in anthropology. I want to announce Shinyu will be pursuing a master's in anthropology at Columbia University next year. So congratulations on that as well. And we look forward to hearing more from Shinyu in the future. So we'll add that to our, I think we have a plaque in the anthropology office, so we'll make sure these names get added, and our names will also be posted on our department website. So anyone can go back and see who the awardees were through the years. You might recognize some of these names. Finally, we have our newest award, which is our Shirley Strum Award for Conservation and the Human Predicament, which is our Climate Change Award. In honor of Shirley Strum, our recently retired biological anthropologist who studies primate behavior and has a big role in understanding conservation of primates. And this year, we have decided to share the award with 2 students who were top students in our new climate change and human solutions major, including Alexandra McDaniel and Taylor Dominic, who both had terrific grades and performed excellently in their climate change courses. So congratulations, Alexandra and Taylor. Are either of you here today? I guess we did not do a great job getting all the students to attend, but that's okay. They will be notified and congratulated. Okay. I think the last thing I want to do, or almost last thing, is to honor all of the honors thesis students this year who wrote an honors thesis, including Pacey, Silas, Jack, Shinyu, Bianca, Sophia, and Jasmine. Terrific job in writing your honors thesis this year. All of these students will graduate with honors because of completing their honors theses this year. And then congratulations to all of our anthropology majors who are graduating this year. You all, we're all very proud of all of you. Let me see, we have, I think, a couple more slides. We want to just acknowledge everyone who helped with undergraduate education at this event. So I'll just mention that we have this terrific mentor protege program that's been led by Dylan Hollingstad O'Brien the past few years. He's a graduate student. And all the graduate student mentors that have been mentoring undergraduate students. I'm sure many in the room have been mentored by grad students through this program. Also want to recognize the Anthropology Club and all of the leadership roles in the Anthropology Club, including Jasmine Martin, Rihan, Adrienne, and Camille. I want to acknowledge our staff who have helped with undergraduate issues and scheduling and mentoring and advising. So Nancy Lee and Debbie Kelly, Sophia Silvestri, and Sage Brand, thank you so much. We want to acknowledge our librarians, who some of which came today, Sarah Kachaluba, Karen Heskett, and Stephanie Labau. Thank you for helping our honor students and all of our undergraduate students in their research endeavors. Want to thank all our lecturers and graduate student associate inns who taught undergraduate courses this year, and our undergraduate and undergraduate teaching assistants, including some of our honors thesis students like Silas, who was also a teaching assistant, and all of these graduate students who were teaching assistants. I won't read all of their names, but thank you for the great work you've done in teaching our undergraduate students this past year. And I apologize if I missed a name or misspelled something as I typed them all in by hand. I may have messed up a name, so apologize. Finally, I just wanted to pass on some updates from our alumni from last year. I didn't give them a lot of time to send me updates, so we only have one who replied, but I wanted to share some news from a few. Michael, I believe, is here still. Michael was a graduate last year in a sociocultural honors thesis that he did, and he's currently finishing his master's dissertation at Oxford University. And I wanted to share this exciting news. He's actually collaborating with another of our graduate honors thesis students from last year, Mariana Gomez Hernandez, to make a short documentary that's actually on the topic of actually both of their theses last year combined together into a documentary. Michael is also applying to National Geographic and Sea-Watch and for a PhD at Oxford in coming years. So congratulations to Michael. And there is a message up here that he wanted to share with the current graduating students. So I'm just going to read it really quickly. He wanted to first and foremost share congratulations on finishing your thesis. I know how much work and determination that takes, and you should be proud. Second, thank you. Thank you for caring and being passionate about your studies. Because of your dedication, you have produced knowledge. How incredible is that? You found a gap in our collective understanding and decided that wasn't okay. And then here's the crucial part. You changed the way the department, our field, and humanity as a whole understand the world and each other. That wouldn't have happened without you. So thank you. We're all better for the knowledge and wisdom that you have brought to us. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Michael, for sharing those words of encouragement and for coming today to support our current students. We really are excited to hear about your accomplishments, so keep sharing them with us and keep us updated. I just wanted to mention another of our honors thesis students last year is also here at UCSD as a graduate student working with me in my lab, Chantel Rabe, and finishing her first year of her PhD at UCSD. And I don't have all the updates from the rest of the class, but I'm sure I'll hear back from them soon and can share them as they come in. So, and I hope that the students graduating this year stay in touch. I'll be asking for updates from you to share with our next year's students. So please keep us up to date on how you're doing and all of your terrific accomplishments, whatever they may be. So congratulations. Anyone want to say any other comments to our students, or any students want to speak as I'm wrapping up the end of our presentations? Paul?
If I may, I'd just like to add congratulations to all, but I certainly also want to thank Professor Amy Nan, who has shepherded us through a very difficult couple of years of undergraduate thesis presentations, and we're very much in her debt. I think we should give her a nice round of applause.
Oh, thank you. I should also say, this is my last year teaching the undergraduate honors students, and I really enjoyed it. It was such a pleasure to work with you guys. I'm going to pass the baton over to Saiba Varma, who is currently our Vice Chair of Undergraduate Studies, and she'll be taking over teaching the honors students next year. So let's all wish good luck to Saiba, and hopefully I'll come back around again in the future. I really enjoyed this. So thank you guys for working with me. Okay. I think that is it. Anyone else want to speak? Or are we at the conclusion of our ceremony? Okay, I guess we are at the end. So thanks you all for coming. We really appreciate it, and the students appreciate your audience. And we'll see you guys next year, hopefully in person. Yeah, best of luck to all of you in your finals. I see that comment in the chat window as well. I know we still have finals week coming up, but hopefully the thesis being completed is a load off for the honors thesis students, and we'll look forward to seeing you at graduation. Great job, everyone. Everyone's just sending some thank yous and congratulations in the chat, so you can scroll through that. Okay, I think we are at the completion, so I will sign off and say thanks, everyone.